So today we're welcomed by Glenn Oosthuysen, who is a marvellous friend of mine that we've known each other for quite some years, but has a really deep experience and background in the clinical mental health game. And today we're really going to discuss a whole bunch of stuff about Glenn's experience and about how that might lend to the conversation around our humanity, especially in our digital age. And we'll see where that goes to today. Glenn, why don't you start us off today with giving us a little bit about your background, and then we might dig into it from there.
Well, my background's a bit of a somewhat different journey to the world in which I've worked the last 25 years. But um, I, when I finished high school, I went and studied political science and international relations. And in fact, I worked in that space doing research and foreign policy and national security stuff. Um, I then went off to the US and did my master's in international and area studies. But about 1 year in, I hit a point where I realized that macro level work didn't make much change in people's lives. That the politics and the vested interests of the macro levels of society it felt rather futile. And I was encouraged into social work, and so I, changed programs, finished the one degree, started the other degree, and qualified in clinical social work. I worked in forensics for a little while straight after graduation, which was in a mental health facility where people were there either because they'd been sentenced to incarceration time uh, and had a mental health issue, or they were awaiting trial. And that was a great start to my professional career. I learned so many things from my time there. And then I moved into more standard counseling world, individuals and couples and family therapy, where I've been the last 25 years, and in management in that space. So, bit of a varied career, but yeah, that's where I am now, at least in that history.
So, how did your early experience, forensic stuff, which I'm really interested and intrigued by, how did that sort of frame your experience and then moving into more of that family individual dynamic? How did that aid or give you the information in a different lens to what you might have had you only come at it from that more of that traditional sort of counselling sort of end?
Yeah. I remember actually when I was in a job interview after my time in forensics. Um, I was being interviewed by an agency manager for the position that eventually took me to Sydney. And he said to me, "What makes you think you can do this work?" And, you know, I smiled at him and I said, "I've worked in forensics. If I can work there, I can work anywhere." um, because it was a great experience at seeing the real underbelly of life. I mean, in my political and national security stuff, I'd work with, you know, work sounds dodgy, but I'd spend time meeting and talking with drug smugglers and gun runners and and people like that, and
Wow.
security forces who probably had, probably should have been in front of the International Criminal Court. Um, so I knew of people like that, but it was a different experience when you're in the role of providing treatment to somebody like that. I worked with people who pushed every button in my sense of what's right and wrong. In terms of my values, in terms of my morality, these were people who were the opposite of that in many ways, the things that they'd done, the crimes they'd committed. I would be assigned a patient, and part of the handover process, I'd be given the police file. Now, it either would be the charges being brought against this person, the full brief of evidence, or it would be that plus the court's findings. So I would know everything about the crime. And it was really quite sickening reading some of the things that had happened in the level of detail that was presented. And I would sit there and I would turn the computer off and think, okay, all right, now I've got to go down to the unit and meet this guy. And I've got to be nice to him. And I've got to help him. And there were times that I'd be like, oh my goodness, really? I have to like this guy? You've got to be kidding me. It's never going to happen. and so starting from that place and then moving into the world I moved into, it was really a lot easier because you weren't really confronted with people who were really at the extremes of, criminal or immoral behaviors. But the lesson I learned stood with me the rest of my career, which was there's no such thing as a bad person. I went into that with a clear, distinct sense of they're good and they're bad people. And here I was confronted by amongst the worst people and discovered in them a humanity I never thought I would discover. And so taking that into what became the rest of my career, I think was a great lesson that said, yeah, there are people who've done terrible things. Let's not excuse or minimize that. But within them still remains goodness that you would be surprised to discover when you look at what they've done.
At the recommendation from my own psychologist, which I've been seeing for a while, he's an amazing guy. I've been reading a book called No Bad Parts, which is sort of similar methodology when we look at those parts that are designed to protect ourselves and don't really define who we are underneath. But you're looking at people who come from a very shady background and trying to get a common ground with them would be much more difficult than the average Joe Blow. You mentioned something in that kind of lead up, in that it challenged your sense of morality. Do you find that people have a different sort of sense of morality depending on sort of the background they come from? And if that's the case, then is there a way that we can define morality from a broader societal sense? It's kind of a challenging thing. Like, do we only look at morality from an individual perspective, or can we look at morality from a much broader perspective? And how do we define that?
Yeah, it's a great problem trying to define morality. If we look at morality in its basic sense, what's right and what's wrong. I'll give you one example. I worked with this guy. He had one of the more horrific crimes that he'd committed was a series of incidents of child abuse of a very young child. He was a real ugly individual to look at. His crime was terribly ugly. And he was also in one of the parts of the police file acknowledged that he had physically assaulted his pregnant girlfriend. And so I'm sitting there, take him out one day, he gets a visitor. And I take him out to go and, wait for his visitor to come. And it's his girlfriend, the pregnant girlfriend who he beat up. And I'm sitting there and I'm not enjoying my time with him. And we're sitting on the bench and I'm trying to make conversation. And I'm like, so, his girlfriend's coming to visit. And I'm like, so, what are you going to talk to her about? And he's like, oh, I want to know how my mother's doing. I'm like, okay, why? And he's like, well, she lives on a street with some real dodgy people. And I'm like, okay, pot calling the kettle black. Here we go. And he's like, some of them are drug dealers, and they're real scum. Okay, that's rich coming from you. And he's like, if I find out that they've been messing with my mother, there'll be big problems. And it was a bizarre moment. I'm sitting there thinking, you. And so I spoke to him a bit about his mother. And it would sound extremely silly to phrase it this way, but I was left with a sense that he's nothing but a little mommy's boy. This horrible individual, by all accounts, loves his mother and will do anything to protect his mother from troublemakers on the street. And it was just a bizarre contrast of morality. I'm sitting there judging him with my morality as a domestic violence, a girlfriend abuser, pregnant girlfriend of that, sexual abuser, molester of children. And he's upholding a standard of morality about don't mess with my mother. I want to protect my mother from the evil in the world. And it's just a bizarre sense of what's morality? You know, I'm looking at morality through one lens and he's looking at morality through another. And that's one of the things, I discovered in that environment as well was, you've heard the saying of honor amongst thieves. This idea that there's a moral code of conduct amongst the criminal. And it's like, how people who are engaged in immoral behavior have a moral code? And so, somewhat to answer your question, um, I think one of the problems we have is when we think that there is one morality. Um, because really, morality is relative. Now, I'm not saying that's right. I'm saying in the world we live in, people have come up with their own idea of what's moral and what's immoral. And that's the code that they live by or the standards by which they judge others. And, I think maybe, I don't know, history is a strange beast, but, was there a time when there was ever a universal moral code? I don't know. I don't think so. Um, I'm going off on a tangent here, but I think of, what's happened in history, at least in my lifetime. Moral standards have become codified into law. And, you know, um, as the moral standards have changed in society and the law has changed, different moral codes get codified into new law. And I think that's one of the recipes for the conflict we have is there's an argument over what's right and what's wrong. And really, it is an individual thing that at certain times society will codify and therefore claim that is society's moral standard. But you can go anywhere in the world to different places in the world, different communities, different societies, different cultural norms, and there's a different morality that is the societal standard for that time and place. And I think, so in that sense I think it's a constantly evolving thing. I'll go back to the statement. I'm not saying that's right. I do personally believe in a universal moral standard, but acknowledging the reality of the world in which we live is people create their own social, cultural, personal moral standards that change over time.
How does it help us in being able to make that distinction between an individual or even a societal morality versus a much more universal one? I think we honestly try to frame everybody inside that universal one and call it our own or call it everybody's, when even the universal one can change depending on our perspective of it. Um, but there is a vast distinction between the two of them, as you've probably rightly said. How does it help us understanding that distinction?
I think if we understand that, we give people room to not be right or wrong, but just to be different.
Okay.
One of the problems we have with a moral position, and we all do this, I mean, I think about working with somebody who gets angry in the traffic. at the heart of their being angry in the traffic is a sense that somebody has behaved in a way that has violated a standard that they think should have been upheld. Um, and so, extrapolate that across society as much as you like in circumstances that exist. And, when we think our moral standard is what others should adhere to, we put ourselves on a collision course with them.
Mm-hmm.
Um, we become right and they become wrong. And, we talk about the world that we live in, the polarization of the world in which we live in. And it's pretty much, if you look at it, I haven't looked too deeply at it, but on the surface, at least, if you look at a lot of the polarization in the world, it boils down to a moral argument of I'm right and you're wrong. I remember this study that was done many years ago. They interviewed Democrats and Republicans in the US, and they interviewed Jews and Palestinians, fairly polarized groups.
Mm-hmm.
And they asked them how they saw themselves. And they said each group predominantly, overwhelmingly saw themselves as the good guys. And they saw the opposition as the evildoers, the horrible, terrible people of the world. And so they saw themselves as good and they saw the others as bad. Now that's very problematic, because what we're really saying is my moral standard, my moral position is superior to somebody else's, and I'm right and they are wrong. Which means, that has implications for humanity, right? How do we treat someone who we see as being fundamentally deceived or evil in terms of the moral position they hold? Yet in each moral position, actually fundamentally is a good. Now that means we can't see the good in the other person's position because we've just judged them to be evil, terrible, unreasonable human beings. Which means our ability to communicate, to reason together, to engage in critical thinking is almost zero at that point, because we're not recognizing that in their moral position also lies a piece of good. So if we then go back to this idea of, so what's the universal morality, the overarching morality that is imposed across all of society, all of humanity? And I think the answer is the good that's held in every position. Every moral position has a kernel of goodness in it. And if we bring all that goodness to the surface, we probably arrive at the universal moral truth.
We
at the end of the day,
tend to arrive on the same ground. We find the common ground, and in the common ground, we can even add to and refine our own. As you know, Glenn, I have a son that's on the autism spectrum, and he has a very strong sense of justice. It's part of his diagnosis, and it's interesting that when he feels like his sense of justice is not being carried out, when something seems unjust to him, he can be very reactionary, and that reactionary state can be judged as being, unjustified. Why are you behaving that particular way? But when you're able to see him for what he is, that he's just seeing things for right and wrong, and he's trying to equate them, and he's responding in that way, then all of a sudden the understanding enables you to look at the behavior and see the person and see the two different things. And I think that kind of defines, I think, the difference that you've outlined is that there's a vast difference between understanding and conflict. And I think that without the understanding, we invariably end up in conflict, and we miss the opportunity to find the common ground. It's an interesting point of view.
I've seen that, especially when I've been doing couples counselling. Sometimes I'll look at a couple, and I've said this to couples at times. Are you two even married to each other? Because you're telling me two entirely different stories. There's two different realities on two different planets. And half of the challenge is trying to discover, okay, hold on, what's true, what's the good intent, and how can we understand where the other one's coming from and what the other one is wanting? Because when we can start to see the good in that, we can start to resolve it and come to a consensus or an agreement. But when we don't understand it, we don't accept it, we think it's motivated from a bad place, conversation stops. And now I no longer am required to entertain this.
Is there a risk um, when our morality seems to move so far away from maybe that universal reality? What happens to humanity in that process? Because there are certain human truths about who we are as human beings, and the behaviors that follow with that. What happens to our humanity in that process? And you would have seen that with your time working with inmates, with people on that side of the law. Do you see a change in morality when in our humanity when some of that humanity is removed? What are some of your observations, experience with that?
It's interesting. Back in the forensic context, there's in groups and out groups, and to be trusted, for an inmate to trust you and be willing to treat you decently, they have to have believed firstly that you're trustworthy and you are treating them decently. And so it's interesting, that they amongst themselves very often would have this um, comfort and familiarity in being inclusive with each other, whereas those who are outside of their world they see as the others, the authoritative or the authoritarian, the ruling forces, the unfair people. And so, what happens to us when we have this divided sense of morality? I think the first thing that suffers is our regard for others. If we live in a world where we believe people fit into they're either good or they're evil, as we just categorize them depending on our morality stance, that leads to a lack of respect. That leads to isolation. That leads to distrust. That leads to a sense of I live in an unsafe world where I'm on the hunt. I'm vigilant to the others. So you may have heard this term called othering people. Make them the other group, and so that's very divisive. But at the individual level, it creates an isolation and a distrust psyche where I go to the supermarket and I don't want to talk to the person at the register because who knows if they're from the other group or not. I don't, there's someone who's different from me, so I don't want to engage with them because they're part of the other tribe. And so what that creates is a sense of threat, a sense of isolation, a sense of reduced connectedness with other people. We live.
What are the things that remove that humanity?
Okay.
Is it a lack of human connection? Is it a lack of human conversation? Is it a lack of not being able to understand someone from another point of view? What are those more minute, probably micro things where we see humanity being questioned or being pulled out or being degraded over time that then results in what you've just talked about?
Yeah, I think it's all of those things, but I think it's also just judgment. If I'm judging somebody, then do I really want to spend time with them? Do I really want to get to know their point of view? Do I really want to engage with them? Do I really want to connect with them? Um, this it creates this distance between people. So the judgment, the characterization as being bad or a threat to me. See, if this person holds a different set of moral standards, and I see that as a threat to my sense of what's moral and right in the world, how am I going to deal with that person? If I see them as being more different to me than similar to me, then they're alien to me. And that's a problem, right?
Mm. And I think in our time that the role of mass media has
Absolutely.
exacerbated that, right? So we've got, I think a long time ago, you might have had the town gossip that was, the person who would determine who was bad or who was good, and they would pass that news around, and then the town would talk about that, and you'd be at the mercy of the town gossip. But now we live in a world of mass media where the idea of swiping left or right to remove someone, and we're making snap judgments at the drop of a hat, or we're scrolling on Facebook and we're seeing 10 million different points of view and profiles, and we're scrolling quickly past them because they don't fit our paradigm. And it's reinforcing this idea of judgment, right? So do you see a difference in time of that
Oh,
sort of?
absolutely.
Are we becoming more isolated in terms of our humanity
Absolutely.
because of that? Or?
Absolutely. So, the advent of social media, even that very, stark image that you use there of swipe left or swipe right. In order to swipe left or swipe right, there's a snap judgment being made. I watch, I've got two daughters and I watch what they do on their phones. And I remember years ago talking to them when they would scroll and just be hitting like or not. There goes the heart emoji. Why? You hardly looked at it. How did you know it was worth a heart? um, and things that they didn't. Exactly. Well, my thought was, how could you form a judgment whether it was likable or unlikable so quickly? And you watch young people. The thumbs are just going, going, going. Like, no, no, like. How could you reach that conclusion? And so the idea of making snap judgments is really enhanced in the brains of younger people, of the social media generation, because that's what it invited them to do. They watch me typing on my phone and they're like, "Why are you so slow?" And I'm like, "Because I'm choosing what I'm saying." I'm choosing what I'm liking or not. Let me consider this. Whereas in the way their brains have shaped, it's like, no, you just make snap judgments. That's all that's required in life. And so when you think about, I mean, I don't say this to be critical of that generation. I just think it's a reality, um, that the idea of engaging deeply in something is becoming a skill. I mentioned earlier the idea of critical thinking. Critical thinking, you must spend time with something to immerse yourself in it. Well, that's becoming something we don't do, right? Because the algorithm gives us what we want to hear, or it shows us how bad the enemy is, right? And so we don't have to challenge our thinking. We just have to reinforce it. We reinforce the idea that they're bad, or we reinforce the idea that we are right. And that actually,
Why are we feeling the need to create those snap judgments? Is it to reinforce our own truth? And why are we needing to reinforce our own truth? Is it because our world is turned upside down? If all of a sudden what we thought to be true is no longer true? What's the fear behind all that?
like, let me give you a theory that I can't prove. So, just my personal theory here is,
Okay.
this is just an opinion, so take it with a total grain of salt. But I think the decline of religion has something to do with this. Religion, right or wrong, whatever religion a person may subscribe to, gave them a sense of a universal good, a universal safety in the way they viewed themselves, their world. When you strip that out of a society, what do they believe in? Where do they find their safety and their hope for the future now? Well, they must find that in themselves, or they must find that in the group to which they belong. And so in order to be reinforced in having a sense of safety, I must see that my worldview is correct, right? Which means I'm not open to looking at a different view because that will destabilize me. That will challenge me in ways that I don't feel confident or secure to process to something that is I can have confidence in, that I can have peace in. And so, the idea that there's this concept called dialectics. And dialectics describes the ability to hold two competing ideas in one place. So in a religious sense, justice and mercy are two different concepts, but how do they coexist and live in the same space? And so, how do I say to somebody, what you're doing is wrong, but you are okay? That's a dialectical concept of those seemingly contradictory things actually exist in one whole. And and that's a skill people don't have. As society continues to create and fuel polarization, black and white thinking, right and wrong judgments, the ability to hold those things in one space is very much on the decline. And if that's on the decline, then people can't actually do it, right? And so the wrestle of trying to do that is destabilizing to an individual. So when you live in a busy world with lots of things going on, I ain't got no time for that. is certainly a response. Just keep it simple, keep it sure and safe and predictable. And there's not a lot of progress in that worldview, but it's one that's fed by technology, media, etc.
Mm. And we end up living in our own echo chamber, of constantly reconstituting what we believe is our sense of right and wrong and our own morality. If the disconnection causes conflict and misunderstanding, and if judgment causes so much issues in our humanity, and we cease to be, we start to remove our humanity, what does it actually mean to be human?
Well, of course, you could look at that through a biological lens, and this is what a human being is, DNA and all that sort of stuff. But I think fundamentally, the type of humanity we're talking about is the ability to have compassion, to show love and respect to other people, to be kind, to treat people the way we would want to be treated, to be honest with people, to not take advantage of people, but to work for the good of others as well as ourselves. Successful human societies have contained all of those elements. But when we come into the world that we were just describing a minute ago, there's not really a need or a function to humanity. If I'm prosecuting a war against your ideas, that actually helps me win the war to not see you as human, right? The idea that
we saw that with the early Germans, right, in the Nuremberg trials, where when the Hitler's the fallout of Hitler's regime, when they were on trial, they were purporting, well, who's to say that it was wrong for us to kill the Jews? Right. For us, that was true and correct. Who are you to say that that's wrong?
Yes.
And challenging someone else's morality means, therefore, I must be right, and you're not allowed to challenge my morality.
Correct. And the idea that, you see that in war, the idea that you killed the enemy is not the same as saying you killed 32 people.
Mm.
You know, you see this. I mean, you know, you see this in the statistics of death in war and conflict.
Mm.
You killed 2,000 people. Doesn't tell you that you killed 2,000 mothers, grandmothers, children, brothers, sisters, fathers, people on the way to work, people who were just fishing on the side of the. It doesn't tell us the human story, it just tells us a number. And a number is dehumanizing. In every individual, there's a story. Every individual has a story. And if we just see people as part of the enemy group, part of the opposition, part of the wrong morality, they're dehumanized. And we can justify that by any number of arguments. The human mind is an amazing machine that can come up with infinite numbers of justifications and reasons for something. But it's easy to let the human mind loose to do that when we're not subscribing to an overriding fundamental that says my first requirement in life is to be human and to treat other humans as I would wish to be treated. If I lose the need for that, sky's the limit, right? To dehumanize someone allows you to come up with any number of justifications for your actions. And that's what happens in war. We dehumanize the people. They're just a number. They're not a person. And that war may be one that throws bombs and shoots bullets, or it may be the war that happens on social media, where the contest of ideas are playing out politically, socially, around the dinner table.
I think you've said something truly powerful, and I kind of got the chills when you said it, that every human has a story. And I think that almost defines what it means to be human, is that I have a human story. And I wonder if all the things that we do that prevents us from being able to listen to, hear, understand the story of another human being, those things are slowly removing our humanity in the process of doing that. And I wonder, in your expertise, do you see any threats with AI in that sort of lens? Do you see anything around the advent of AI that would prevent us from or challenge our sense of losing our humanity?
That's a great question. I think one of the dangers of AI, one of the primary dangers of AI, is it removes our need to interact with a different human being. It becomes a technological automation process. I had this little moment of crisis the other day using ChatGPT. I asked ChatGPT to do something for me, and it did. And I had this kind of weird little mental, oh, was I supposed to say thank you or please? And it was like, and a part of my brain is like, it's nobody. You don't have to say any of that. It's just a computer. It doesn't care. You're not going to hurt its feelings. Yeah. And at the same time, that was a concern. All right, because if I'm practicing interacting with AI where I know it's just a machine, it's just an algorithm, it's just a data set of some sort, am I going to lose humane communication? I'm going to lose the ability to be sensitive, to be respectful, to have empathy. Am I going to call somebody and get a human being and be like, just execute what I need now? Or am I going to say, you sound tired today. Has it been a long day? Oh, yeah, it's been a really long day. Am I going to have that conversation, or will I lose that skill? And we already see that with our young people who, they stand at a dance next to their friends chatting on their phone rather than talking face to face. We see their increased social anxiety, their increased discomfort at communicating person to person. So when AI is taking over the communication space, that becomes less of a skill people are practicing, less of a skill set, less of an awareness in our human to human interaction. The fact that people can jump on social media and say horrendous things to somebody who's just a concept that they won't say to them in person. Yeah, and I worry where that goes for us as a human society when we stop actually interacting with people and being mindful of all the things that are important in that interaction, and we just get used to talking to machines. Where do we learn to to see the person?
My kids have my older two teenagers. They have this habit of walking around the house with their phone, and they have friends on the other end of the phone, and they're on like some sort of video chat, whatever platform they're on, and they're having this ongoing conversation, but it's not actually a conversation. They're just walking around the house with the other person, and the other person is doing their own thing, walking around their house. And every now and then they'll say something stupid or silly, and they might have an interaction, but there's no actual conversation going on. There's no actual sharing of story and listening to story, and vice versa, as we've talked about. And so we're developing this. There's this device that enables us to be in the same space as somebody else, but not actually be there. And we see that, even myself, I can be around my wife and I can be distant and I'm not actually there, and it takes me a bit to recognize, hang on a second, you're here with your wife. Now it's time to be with your wife, or it's time to be with your kid in this moment. And so, moving to the Sunshine Coast recently, I've made a habit of, like, I took my daughter out for fishing yesterday. I said, okay, let's go. Let's put all devices away. And she, even without asking, naturally said, oh, I'll just leave my phone here, because she was going fishing with dad, in the afternoon, and it didn't require anything other than being in nature and having a conversation. Makes me wonder the advent of the machine, and how much we're losing in that process. Obviously, there's some great tools that enable us to have more time to spend with people, but are we actually spending more time, or are we just trying to get more productivity? That's a scary question for another day, perhaps. But
My mother lives in England, and so technology allows me to talk to her, and sometimes she'll be willing to put the video on and to see her and see how she's doing. So it's a
yeah,
great tool for connection. But when people are using it in other ways, where,
mm,
you know, here's a photo of my meal, like or unlike, so what? Has that really fostered human connection? I mean, it's created a sense of connection. I see what you had for lunch today. But is that human connection? And I think that's the risk. We've got this pseudo connection happening where it
mm,
has the appearance of connectedness, but it's not happening at very deep, personal, human levels. So when you and your daughter go off fishing, she doesn't take her phone, you are present with each other. You're talking to each other. You're learning
mm.
about each other. You're not just sharing a photo with each other of sitting with a fishing rod in your hand. It doesn't deliver anywhere near the same real human connection. And I think those are some of the challenges. So there's, on the one hand, an example of my mother and I, it's a tool for increased connection. But on the other hand, the way it's mostly being used, it's pseudo connection. And that is not
Mm.
helpful to our humanity or our connectedness in life.
I heard an alarming statistic this morning on the radio, and it said something like, um, an extravagant number of 17 to 35-year-olds are becoming much more confident in allowing AI to tell them how to spend their money or how to invest their money. And I'm not saying that's good or bad, but it's just highlighting that we have a younger generation that are very comfortable with a machine making a risky human decision around how that might affect our future. And I guess our hope from the conversation that we've had today is that we might be able to retain some of that humanity so that we don't lose our story. And that I know from an Aboriginal perspective that the story is very important to their culture. But I think from a human perspective, if we lose the idea that there is a story behind that individual, who I was getting frustrated by because they were mowing the lawn right before we were ready to start recording today, and I was worried about the noise and how that was going to impact me. But that person was just trying to do their job, right? So I think that if we lose the idea of the story, then we lose our ability to connect, and I think that's the danger. But I think there's opportunity to connect, and I think that we need to find ways of doing that.
Years ago, I came across the story of a guy. He was a photojournalist. I think it was for Time magazine or Newsweek or something. And he was a photojournalist in Ethiopia during the famine. And of course, there've been multiple famines in Ethiopia, but one of the really bad ones in the 80s and 90s. And, kids were just dying of starvation. And he started a habit of taking a photograph of a child and giving it to the parents as a keepsake. And he was motivated to do it because he realized that when that child died, that family had nothing to remember that child by. I mean, they had nothing. They were living in poverty and famine. And there was no way of keeping that child alive for them. The child had no story anymore. But he would take a photo and give it to every family so that they could keep the story of that child alive. And I thought it was a super powerful example of how we actually have to work to keep a story and to honor a human being's story, regardless of their morality, regardless of their circumstance. There's a story behind that person that is bigger than the issues that may divide us or bring us together or technology's place in our world. What is the story of the human being? That's how we retain our humanity. And if our morality can elevate our humanity, well, then we're on the right road. But when our morality causes us to reduce our humanity, that's rather questionable morality in my mind. Certainly doesn't lead us anywhere good.
Yeah, what an amazing formula, I think. And that's an amazing place to wrap up the conversation. And I think we can take that moving forward, and that if we can elevate our morality so that it increases our human experience, then I think it'll help us with our lawmaking, with our interactions with every individual, with how we spend our money, with how we spend our time, but more importantly, how we treat each other. Thank you so much for your time, Glenn, and for your expertise,
Thanks,
the
Lincoln.
stories, the experiences. I think it's going to lend an important light as we move forward in this era. So thank you.